Under the blazing Persian sun of 522 BCE in the grandeur of the royal palace of Susa history, paused to witness a moment of chilling significance. King Cambyses II, heir to the visionary Cyrus the Great, stood not merely as a monarch, but as the embodiment of justice. That day he would not wage war against a foreign enemy, but strike against something far more insidious, corruption festering within the heart of his empire. Before him knelt Sisamnes, a man once cloaked in dignity, now stripped of everything but fear. A royal judge, his robes had once symbolized fairness, wisdom, and honor. Yet in accepting gold to twist the scales of justice, he had betrayed not only his duty, but the very foundation upon which Persia stood. The court was silent yet heavy with anticipation. Courtiers, nobles, and foreign emissaries gathered not for spectacle, but for a lesson. The air was thick with the weight of a kingdom about to redefine the meaning of accountability. Cambyses, young yet unyielding, prepared to deliver a verdict not just for one man, but for generations. This was no ordinary punishment. It was a message carved into flesh and memory, justice in its most ruthless, unforgettable form. In that moment, the king became more than a ruler. He became a warning, a symbol, a reminder that even the most powerful must kneel before the law. And so as the first cry from Sisamnes shattered the silence, Persia listened, not with ears, but with its soul. The punishment that followed was cruel, but it was clear. In the empire of Cambyses, justice would not be bought, and betrayal, no matter how veiled in robes or gold, would always find its reckoning. In the heart of an empire that spanned from the sands of India to the shores of the Mediterranean, the weight of justice rested on the shoulders of a chosen few. Among them was Sisamnes, a man once honored with the sacred duty of judging right from wrong. Yet in a single fateful moment, he chose gold over honor, ushering in his own undoing. The case seemed routine, perhaps too small to catch the eye of the throne. A land dispute between nobles, just one of many that crossed the judge's desk. But beneath its surface stirred something darker: ambition, greed, and a fatal assumption that no one would notice, that justice could be twisted behind closed doors and left to rot in silence. Sisamnes, entrusted with the voice of fairness, allowed it to be silenced. He knew the truth. He knew the arguments. And he knew one of them held no merit. But when offered a bribe, the gleam of gold blurred the lines between right and wrong. With pen in hand and a verdict preordained, he sentenced not just a man, but the very principle he was sworn to uphold. It was more than corruption. It was betrayal not only of his office, but of every citizen who looked to the law as a shield. In that moment, Sisamnes became a symbol of everything justice was meant to resist. But justice, even when momentarily silenced, has ears. What Sisamnes did not know was that truth has its own champions. One loyal scribe watching silently refused to let injustice pass. And from that quiet defiance, a storm would rise, one that would strip away the illusion of secrecy and bring the full weight of judgment upon a man who thought himself untouchable. Truth has a way of surviving even in shadows. Though Sisamnes believed his crime would go unnoticed, that gold could cover the scent of guilt, he underestimated the quiet strength of those who served not power but principle. In a courtroom thick with ceremony and hierarchy, it was not a noble or a soldier, but a humble scribe who became the voice of justice. This scribe, loyal not to privilege but to truth, watched as the law was bent, twisted under the weight of greed. He saw injustice clothed in formality, and he refused to let it pass. With quiet resolve, he gathered evidence, each detail a whisper against the thunder of corruption. And when the moment came, he carried that truth not to the streets, but to the throne itself. King Cambyses, young, fierce, unflinching, did not delay. His father Cyrus the Great had ruled with vision. Cambyses would rule with justice. The king returned from war not to rest, but to restore the balance that Sisamnes had shattered. No empire, however vast, can endure without integrity at its core. Before a full court, the trial unfolded. The accused, once revered, stood exposed. Witnesses spoke. Documents were read. The scribe's voice, though calm, echoed louder than armies. And when the judge himself, cornered by irrefutable proof, confessed, it was not relief that filled the hall, but something far heavier: reckoning. The courtroom, once a place of power and procedure, became a crucible. There Cambyses reminded his people that justice would not be mocked, not under his reign. This was not a private correction. It was a public reckoning, a declaration that no robe, no title could shield one from the truth. In that chamber, justice did not whisper. It thundered. When the gavel falls on the guilty, justice is usually swift. But in the case of Sisamnes, the punishment was not only swift, it was unforgettable. King Cambyses II, unwilling to let corruption fester beneath the skin of his empire, chose a sentence so brutal, so impossibly symbolic that it would scar memory itself. Sisamnes, once the hand that wielded the law, now stood helpless beneath it, dragged into the palace courtyard, not as a judge, but as an example. There would be no mercy. His crime had not merely wronged a noble, it had wounded the soul of the empire. And so before the eyes of nobles, diplomats, and ordinary citizens, the execution began. No blindfold, no secrecy. This was not about vengeance, it was about memory. The court needed to remember what justice cost when it was sold. The flaying was meticulous, methodical, a slow separation of skin from soul. Each incision a mirror of every verdict he sold, every truth he buried. His screams didn't just echo across stone, they echoed through conscience. Some turned away, others fainted. Cambyses did not flinch. He watched, not out of cruelty, but conviction. Justice to be preserved must sometimes be made visible. But it was not enough that Sisamnes die, his lesson had to live. When the last strip of skin was removed, it was not discarded. It was treated, preserved, transformed into a grotesque emblem of justice betrayed. And then, as if history needed to drive the point deeper, it became the very seat upon which his son Outrage would sit as the new judge. A chair made of a father's failure. A son bound to judgment by the flesh of betrayal. No words were needed. The message was clear. Justice would not be compromised. Not again. The punishment of Sisamnes was never meant to be forgotten. It wasn't simply about punishing a corrupt judge. It was about redefining the very essence of justice in the Persian Empire. What Cambyses II ordered was more than execution. It was transformation. Through one man's suffering, a system found its spine. By flaying Sisamnes alive and preserving his skin as the material of a judge's chair, Cambyses crafted a symbol that surpassed generations. This was not an act of barbarism for its own sake. It was deliberate, calculated, and haunting. It turned the courtroom itself into a theater of memory where justice would forever be seated upon the consequences of betrayal. Every time Outrage, Sisamnes' own son, entered the court and sat on that ghastly throne, he didn't just inherit a title, he inherited a warning. He carried the weight of his father's failure on his shoulders and under his skin. Each judgment he passed would be a whisper to his conscience, remember upon what you sit. This symbolic cruelty served a greater function. In a kingdom too vast to govern by presence alone, symbols had to speak louder than laws. And this one did. It proclaimed that justice was sacred, incorruptible, and merciless toward those who dared defile it. The chair became a relic, a reminder, a vow in leather and blood that truth must never be sold. Such symbolism was not meant to instill fear alone, but accountability. It was a message to every magistrate across Persia: power is a privilege, not a shield. And those who twist the law will not only fall, but fall loudly for all to see and for all to learn. In that chair, justice sat not comfortably, but consciously. And that, perhaps, was Cambyses' true legacy. Time has a way of softening the edges of even the most brutal stories, but not this one. The flaying of Judge Sisamnes, ordered by King Cambyses II, transcended its ancient roots to become something far more enduring, a symbol that still breathes unease and reflection into every society it touches. Recorded by Herodotus, the father of history, the tale was never merely a gruesome anecdote. It became a moral compass etched into the pages of civilization. Centuries later, as Europe emerged from medieval darkness, artists looked back not to glorify the violence, but to resurrect the message. In 1498, Flemish painter Gerard David immortalized the punishment in vivid oil and brush strokes. Hung in the town hall of Bruges, the painting wasn't just decoration, it was a civic warning. A reminder to every judge who walked beneath it: justice is a duty, not a privilege. Other artists followed. Engravings, sketches, reproductions, all bearing the same silent scream. The imagery is as haunting now as it was then, a man's flesh torn, not only from his body, but from the trust he betrayed. Yet perhaps what is most remarkable is that even in the 21st century, this ancient tale continues to stir action. In 2012, activists protesting judicial corruption in Russia brought reproductions of David's painting to a courthouse. They needed no slogans. The image alone said everything. Sisamnes' legacy is not one of martyrdom, but of warning. His name lives not in reverence, but in caution. His story has become a mirror held up to every legal system, every judge, every nation that dares to forget what happens when justice is sold. Some legacies inspire, others warn. Sisamnes' does both, bleeding through time, reminding us that power without principle is history doomed to repeat itself. Centuries have passed since Sisamnes was flayed alive, yet the shadow of his failure stretches into our present. Though our courtrooms are no longer stained with such visceral punishments, the weight of his betrayal still lingers, reminding us that when justice is sold, it's not just individuals who bleed, but entire societies. In today's world, we pride ourselves on progress, on the evolution of law, rights, and democracy. Yet corruption, like a slow poison, still seeps through cracks in the system. The tale of Sisamnes forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Integrity in judgment is not just a legal requirement, it is a moral foundation. When it crumbles, everything else follows. We may recoil at the cruelty of Cambyses' sentence, but its intent remains relevant. It was not punishment for spectacle. It was a message engraved in skin and time that no title, no robe, no seat of power can protect the corrupt from consequence. And more importantly, that justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be sacred. Sisamnes' chair, grotesque as it was, served a purpose we've not outgrown. It turned justice into a living reminder. A judge seated on his father's skin became a metaphor for inherited responsibility, an image that asks, upon what do we build our judgments today? In an age of hidden deals, political favoritism, and legal manipulation, the echoes of that ancient courtyard grow louder. The story calls out not from myth, but from our headlines. It asks us to demand more, to expect better, and to remember that law without integrity is tyranny disguised in order. Sisamnes' legacy is not meant to haunt us, it's meant to awaken us, to remind us that justice must never be for sale. Because once it is, no society, ancient or modern, can stand. As the echoes of Sisamnes' screams fade into history, what remains is not just the memory of a brutal punishment, but a haunting question that still speaks to us today. What happens when those meant to uphold justice become its greatest betrayers? This was never just the story of one man's downfall. It's the story of how fragile integrity can be and how powerful its absence truly is. In flaying Sisamnes and turning his skin into a symbol, King Cambyses wasn't seeking revenge, he was defending the soul of a nation. Because without honest judgment, there can be no trust. Without trust, no society can endure. In our world, corruption rarely screams, it whispers. It hides behind the smiles, titles, and polished speeches. But the damage it causes is no less severe. The legacy of Sisamnes urges us to remain vigilant, to hold power accountable, and to remember that the greatest threat to a nation doesn't always come from the outside, but often from within. Justice is sacred. Power must be principled. And those who betray both must answer not only to kings, but to history. So the next time we hear of injustice, let us not turn away. Let us remember a judge who thought no one was watching and a king who made sure no one would ever forget.